Our Gapminder topic observes the relationship between the number of children per woman and other societal factors, including GDP per capita, women's education status, maternal health, agriculture versus urbanization levels, and contraceptive use. Though the world as a whole has been trending towards less children per woman, these factors have a particularly pronounced effect. We start off comparing the number of children per woman to women's education level. The higher the woman's educational attainment, the fewer children she is likely to bear. Women with higher education are more likely to earn more money and have better, higher-paying jobs. Women who attend post-secondary education are more likely to delay marriage and have smaller families, as they are more conscious of family planning since it is more expensive to have children. Ethiopia provides interesting insight to this trend. In 1994, the country increased the education budget and instituted school lunches in rural areas. The 1987 cohort of young girls exposed to these reforms showed a 7 percentage point reduction in the probability of teenage birth rates and a similar reduction in the probability of marriage. The mean years of education for women has increased in Ethiopia, as women were having on average 7.4 children in 1987 compared to 5 children in 2009. Looking at Nigeria and Kenya, which also instituted educational reforms in the 1980s and the 1990s, saw an increase in the number of years women stayed in school, as well as reducing early fertility rates. On a broader scale, female education has a direct effect on fertility, and that more educated women have a higher opportunity cost from bearing children when taking into account their foregone income, as well as reaping the benefits their education allows them. This increase in education, coupled with the fact women are living longer, would show there are fewer births. Along with this, the age at marriage has also increased, which shows that women are waiting longer to start families. With all of this, there have been other factors that have affected the number of children each woman is having. One factor is the two-child law that was introduced in the UK, Vietnam, Iran, Singapore, and China. For example, China's birth rate went from the average woman having 6 children to having just under 3 children. This shows that government policy has played a role in the decline of birth rates per woman. Another way the birth rate has been impacted is by contraceptive use. Throughout our research, we discovered almost all countries follow the downward trend, but sub-Saharan African countries are always slightly higher than the rest of the world. These countries hover at around 5 children per woman compared to the average of 2.33 per woman. This can be linked to the amount of contraceptive use globally, where recently 64% of women used contraceptives, while only 33% did in Africa. Additionally, 12% of women globally are seen to have an unmet need for family planning, while Africa is at 24%. As seen through this, the use of contraceptive has, like the two-child law, reduced the number of children women are having. Family planning, education, and contraceptives have led to the decline of children per woman, along with the urbanization factor of many countries. In countries such as China and India, agriculture was much more prominent, which affected the number of babies women were having. Data from the 1960s to today shows that countries with higher agricultural production, GDP, and agricultural workers, percent of labor force, showed women having more babies on average. One specific example of this trend is China. In 1961, women in China were having on average 3.28 babies. By 1963, they were having on average 7.28 babies. During this time, the agricultural first policy in China was implemented, which prioritized agricultural production. The rate of babies per woman more than doubled to 7.28, and agriculture was at 39.9% of GDP. The urban population at this time didn't increase significantly either. Now, agricultural production is 10% of China's GDP, and the urban population is 679 million. Women are now averaging 1.54 babies. In some African countries today, where agriculture is still over 40% of the GDP, women are having an average of 5.37 children. As urban populations increased, babies per woman decreased. When comparing GDP per capita to the average number of children per woman, one can see that generally, as income begins to rise during the later half of the 19th century, the number of children decreases. The drop in number of children is initially led by France, which in 1840 had a GDP per capita of 2,180 and an average of 3 children per woman. But 11 years later, the average French woman had only 1 child, even as GDP per capita decreased to 2,110. This suggests it's not a one-to-one causation, but more of a floor and ceiling scenario. The United Kingdom, Italy, and Germany display similar statistics as France supports this hypothesis. Each nation's child rate falls from an average of 2 per woman to only 1 once their GDP per capita rises above the $2,000 watermark of floor. The change in birth rate seems to be a reaction from people who feel confident their new, higher incomes will stay permanent, as the drop lags slightly behind the rise in GDP per capita. This trend extends beyond the European continent, as Japan's number of children per woman falls from 4 to 3 and finally to 1, as GDP per capita rises above the $1,500 and $2,500 mark respectively. Obviously, these exact numbers don't hold as cultural factors, and cost of living are unique in different places. But the general concept of a minimum GDP per capita that must be achieved to lower the number of children, and the lag from the rise in incomes to the subsequent fall in children per woman, from people concerned about their security and their newfound wealth, persists.